Excerpt from In Search of the Unknown. Notice there's no sort of synopsis of the main idea in the beginning. Some passages have that. Terrific main idea reference. Always read it if it's there, but not in this case. It is not very long paragraphs. Occasionally we get long paragraphs, and this is the opposite. We're getting very short one-sentence paragraphs. So again, many times we have got to put together several sentences to create the idea of what's going on. So sections might have an idea associated with it. Let's begin reading. Excerpt from In Search of the Unknown. It was at that time the policy of the trustees and officers of the zoological gardens neither to employ collectors nor to send out expeditions in search of specimens. The society decided to depend upon voluntary contributions, and I was always busy part of the day in dictating answers to correspondents who wrote offering their services as hunters of big game, collectors of all sorts of fauna, trappers, snarers, and also to those who offered specimens for sale, usually at exorbitant prices. Okay, this is a first-person narrative, so our author is the narrator telling his story, apparently as he's working at the zoo. He responds to all the people who are trying to give the zoo or sell to the zoo various animals. That's paragraph 1. To the proprietors of mangy lynxes, moth-eaten coyotes, dancing bears, I returned courteous but uncompromising refusals. Of course, first submitting all such letters together with my replies to Professor Farrago. Okay, so part of this person's job, the narrator, is to respond to all the people who are trying to sell animals. Well, he refers to these animals as mangy, moth-eating, and dancing bears, which come from circuses. Clearly animals that he doesn't respect, he's not looking at in a good light, probably unworthy for the zoo, and he's refusing them. Of course, as he says, as if there's no question. Okay, but apparently he's got to go by or pass everything by Professor Farrago. So who's Professor Farrago? Somebody else, maybe his boss, not clear at this point. Paragraph 3. One day towards the end of May, however, as I was leaving Bronx Park to return to town, Professor Lessard of the Reptilian Department called out to me that Professor Farrago wanted to see me at a moment. So I retraced my steps to the temporary wooden building occupied by Professor Farrago, General Superintendent of the Zoological Gardens. Okay, he's general, so it sounds like maybe he's superior, a boss. The professor, who was sitting at his desk before a pile of letters and replies submitted for approval by me, pushed his glasses down and looked over them at me with a whimsical smile that suggested amusement, impatience, annoyance, and perhaps a faint trace of apology. Now, here's a letter. So let's recap up to this point real quick. We know the narrator works at the zoo, and the zoo has to accept animals from others, whether given, gifted, or for sale. He responds to those requests, usually with no's, because most of the animals aren't, obviously not worthy for the zoo. And one day he was called in by the professor, which is the guy he has to pass all his refusals by, presumably his boss or someone senior at the zoo. Now, here's a letter, he said, with a deliberate gesture toward a sheet of paper impaled on a file. A letter that I suppose you remember. He disengaged the sheet of paper and handed it to me. Oh, yes, I replied with a shrug. Of course, the man is mistaken, or what? Demanded Professor Farrago, tranquilly wiping his glasses. Or liar, I replied. So notice we're going into dialogue here. In fact, all these one-liners throughout appear to be dialogue. Okay? So there's a lot of dialogue here back and forth. So a couple things we want to think about in dialogue. Number one, it's kind of like a play. But in a play, they at least tell you who's talking, right? If you read a play, a script. Here, it doesn't. So you've got to be careful of who is talking. 4, it's the narrator talking. 5 is the professor responding. 4 is the professor talking, 5 is the narrator responding, and 6 is the professor again, and then the narrator, and 7. See, I even messed it up temporarily, so be careful. The other thing is that comes out of dialogue, you're literally seeing the conversation. So it brings it kind of to life, and a lot of the ideas will be demonstrated. So if you've ever written a story and maybe your teacher's told you to show, don't tell, You're actually showing here in many cases. You're demonstrating the idea, you're not showing. You're not saying Mary was sad. It might say instead, tears were dribbling down Mary's cheeks. Well, you can assume she's sad or crying at that point, right? So look for that. That happens a lot in dialogue. It's going to be more demonstrative, okay? So clearly the professor is saying, oh, there's a letter here, and the narrator is saying that letter is wrong. The guy is either mistaken or lying. Let's move on to 8. After a silence, he leaned back in his chair and bade me read the letter to him again, and I did so with a contemptuous tolerance for the writer, who must have been either a very innocent victim or a very stupid swindler. I said as much to Professor Farrago, but to my surprise he appeared to waver. I suppose, he said with a nearsighted, embarrassed smile, that 999 men in 1,000 would throw that letter aside and condemn the writer as a liar or fool. In my opinion, I said, he's one or the other. He isn't in mine, said the professor placidly. So what's happened here from 8 to 11? The narrator is clearly believing this letter is almost a fraud for some reason, right? It can't be right. The professor, for the first time, tells us that no, he actually believes it. So this is not neutral by any respect. The narrator is almost condescending. It's not just negative, but very negative in terms of an SHSAT passage. He's condescending, a liar, mistaken, a swindler, basically a fraud, okay? So 11, he isn't mine. What? I exclaimed, paragraph 12. Here's a man living all alone on a strip of rock and sand between the wilderness and the sea who wants to send you somebody to take charge of a bird that doesn't exist. Okay, now we know what the letter's about. Some bird that apparently doesn't exist. How do you know, asked Professor Farrago, that the bird in question does not exist? It is generally accepted, I replied sarcastically, that the great auk has been extinct for years. Therefore, I may be pardoned for doubting that our correspondent possesses a pair of them alive. Apparently, what we're telling us in 12 to 14 is that this is a letter where some guy says he has 2 great auks, which apparently are generally accepted to be extinct. Okay. Paragraph 15, the next page. Oh, you young fellows, said the professor, smiling wearily, you embark on a theory for destinations that don't exist. He leaned back in his chair, his amused eyes searching space for the imagery that made him smile. Like swimming squirrels, you navigate with the help of heaven and a stiff breeze, but you never land where you hope to, do you? So what's the professor saying? He's kind of, at this point, making fun of our narrator, who's a young fellow, or one among a young fellow. And he points out, the reasoning these guys, young fellows, pursue is not always correct. I'm not sure what the whole idea of help of heaven and a stiff breeze is referring to, and swimming squirrels, I'm not sure what that is, but ultimately it says you don't end up where you want to, right? So he's basically kind of making fun of the narrator a little bit. So 18, rather red in the face, I said, don't you believe the great auk to be extinct? So now the narrator is actually on his heels a little. He's rather red in the face. Well, that implies he's probably embarrassed, right? He's maybe angry, gets you red in the face, but I don't think he's angry here. I think he's more embarrassed. Don't you believe the great auk to be extinct? He's asking the professor now. Like it's a fact, apparently, right? And he's kind of embarrassed that the professor doesn't agree with his logic. Audubon saw the great auk. Who has seen a single specimen since? So this is all the narrator talking. Nobody except our correspondent here, he replied, laughing. So the professor replies, nobody except the correspondent. I laughed too, considering the interview at an end, but the professor went on coolly. So he's laughing, and they're laughing together, but they clearly have different opinions, right? It's kind of, why would they be laughing? Because there's a little uncomfortableness, maybe nervousness going on here is the idea, okay? 23, whatever it is that our correspondent has, and I'm daring to believe that it is in italics. That means the professor in this case who's speaking is emphasizing that he believes it really is the great auk itself. I want you to secure it for the society. Okay. 24, when my astonishment subsided, my first conscious sentiment was one of pity. Clearly, Professor Farrago was on the verge of dotage. Aha, what a loss to the world. So dotage is a loss of reasoning brought about by old age. So he's basically now thinking, the author's going a little kooky. He's getting old, right? He's losing his memory and his reasoning powers. I believe now that Professor Farago perfectly interpreted my thoughts, which would be what? Farago knows that the narrator doesn't believe a word of this. He's highly skeptical at best. But he betrayed neither resentment nor impatience. Okay? So the professor's not angry, he's not resentful, and he's not impatient, even though he knows the author is kind of thinking this is really silly and that maybe the professor is going cuckoo. He knows it. The professor does. I drew a chair up beside his desk. There was nothing to do but obey. Well, if there's nothing to do, obey, that really suggests that, in fact, he's working for the professor. That probably is his boss or somehow superior at the zoo. And this fool's errand was none of my conceiving. And this guy clearly wanted none of it. So 26, together we made out a list of articles necessary for me and itemized the expenses I might incur, and I set a date for my return, allowing no margin for a successful termination of the expedition. So wait, what's this last part? This is basically the author's putting a plan together, but he has no belief or faith whatsoever to think that this is actually going to succeed, that there is even a great auk because it's extinct. 27, never mind that, said the professor. Never mind that. What's he referring to? The list, maybe. Everything that he's writing out is the plan. He kind of knows, the professor, what the author's thinking, that he doesn't believe it. Never mind that. So he's kind of knows that and sort of overrides him and says, what I want you to do is go get those birds here safely. Now, how many men will you take? So the professor clearly knows the doubts of the narrator here, but he doesn't care. He's still, effectively the senior person there. And he's telling him, you're going to go get those birds and you're going to bring them back now safely. 28, our narrator replies, none. I replied bluntly. It's a useless expense unless there's something to bring back. If there is, that is something to bring back, a great auk, for example, I'll wire you, you may be sure. Okay? So he's saying, I will tell you how much to spend or how many men or whatever if there is indeed a great auk or two of them. Very well, said Professor Farago good-humoredly. You shall have all the assistance you may require. Can you leave tonight? Okay? So, 30. The old gentleman was certainly prompt. I nodded, half sulkily, aware of his amusement. So, I said, picking up my hat, I am to start north to find a place called Black Harbor, where there is a man named Halyard, who possesses, among other household utensils, 2 great auks, extinct great auks. We were both laughing by this time, so at least they kind of realized there's some level of humor and disbelief between them, so they're not angry at each other. I asked why on earth he credited the assertion of a man he had never before heard of. Okay. So, 3rd page, it's getting a little long. I suppose, he replied, so our ideas change here. I suppose, he replied with the same half apologetic, half humorous smile, it is instinct. I feel somehow that this man Halyard has, again emphasizing through the italics, he has got an auk, perhaps 2. I can't get away from the idea that we are on the eve of acquiring the rarest of living creatures. It's odd for a scientist to talk as I do. Doubtless you're shocked. Admit it now. But turning directions, we're changing with the contrasting transition. I was not shocked. Well, hold on. So far, the author's been shocked in disbelief that there could be auks and why the professor would believe it. On the contrary, I was conscious that the same strange hope that Professor Farago cherished was beginning, in spite of me, to stir my pulses too. So wait a second. Now the narrator, he's kind of buying into the possibility that there could be 2 auks, right? At first, he completely discarded the idea. 35. If he has, I began, then stopped. So he stopped in mid-sentence. Why? The professor and I looked hard at each other in silence. Go on, he said encouragingly. That's the professor. But, again, changing directions, I had nothing more to say, for the prospect of beholding with my own eyes a living specimen of the great auk produced a series of conflicting emotions within me, which rendered speech profanely superfluous. So basically, he kind of got to the point where he really couldn't put it into words, right? He couldn't speak any further because I guess now he's starting to believe the professor to some degree, or at least a hope that this might be true. So he's got conflicting emotions, right? He's against it, yet he wants to believe it at this point. And that rendered his speech profanely superfluous, which essentially is, meaningless, right? The speech is meaningless. It's just the feeling, the conflict within him. And he's just going to have to go find out by going up to see Halyard, or whoever the guy is who has the birds. Okay? All right, that's the idea of our passage. So I got to get a sense of what the viewpoints are here. We've got the professor's viewpoint. We've got the narrator's viewpoint. They seem to be conflicting, but at the end, the narrator seems to buy into the argument a little bit. And that it could be very interesting if it's there. So it's worth a trip. Obviously, topic is the great auk, this extinct bird. They want to find it again. They think they might. And why is this interesting? Well, it's kind of the communication back and forth between the author and the professor. And dialogue is the means by which the author really brings out the storyline and the conflict here. So if we have a rhetorical development question, I suspect we probably will, it's probably going to reference the dialogue here. Okay, let's begin to answer the questions.